The guy does all the work. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Atlantic Council, thank you for being here. My name is Stephen Shapiro, and it is my privilege to serve as a director of the Atlantic Council and as a supporter of the valuable and important work of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and its Transatlantic Security Initiative. The Scowcroft Center develops sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and, in fact, the world. The center honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership in cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Because of the return to great power competition, the center is pursuing ever harder its work on defense issues to help enhance national security policy making. Now must be the golden age of new security concepts. And so the Scowcroft Center has determined that a key work stream is the development of novel concepts, leveraging new technologies to strengthen U.S. and allied defense planning efforts. The Transatlantic Security Initiative applies the center's ethos to address the most pressing issues facing the transatlantic community. And of course, the security of the Baltic Sea region is a core focus of their work. Our program this morning addresses a novel developing idea in NATO frontline member state defense, the Porcupine Defense. Barry Pavel, the center's director and a senior vice president of the council, has done me the honor of asking me to make this introduction today because of my long interest in this area. And today we look at the Porcupine Defense through the lens of the Baltics and the use of new technologies to enable it. Our program features the launch of an important issue brief, The Melians Revenge, How Small Frontline European States Can Employ Emerging Technology to Defend Against Russia, by Dr. T.X. Hummus, who will deliver the opening address. Dr. Hummus is a distinguished research fellow at the Center for Strategic Research, part of the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. He's a veteran of the Marine Corps, author of many books and over 100 articles. Dr. Hummus is a big thinker, and I had the pleasure of encountering him at the Naval War College's Thinking Out of the Box workshops last year, where in fact the Porcupine Defense was pursued. Following his talk, we will dive into those ideas with a panel of experts that Barry will moderate. They include Scowcroft Center non-resident senior fellow Kathleen McInnes, Richard Hooker of the National Defense University, and Roland Henens, defense counselor at the Embassy of Latvia to the United States. Thank you all for making the time to be here today. When I told my wife yesterday, she's a New York City veterinarian, that I was introducing a program on the Porcupine Defense, she reminded me of a vacation we took some years ago up in Maine, when on one July 4, she heroically extracted some 65 porcupine quills from inside the bleeding mouth of an awake German shepherd who had plainly made a bad decision. After her reminder, she looked at me and said, well, obviously, the best defense, obviously, is simply to keep the dog away from the porcupine. No, sweetheart, I replied, that's not what we're talking about tomorrow. But yes, in fact, that is what we're talking about. And she was right. Keep the dog away from the porcupines, or in this case, keep the bear away from the rim states. This is, in fact, the practical idea behind the Porcupine Defense. NATO's traditional concept of defense is that the rim states serve essentially as crushable car bumpers, absorbing the blow from the enemy long enough for the United States to get across the Atlantic with enough resources to fight its way in and kick the adversary out. But this long-held strategy might give way to a concept whereby those states, whether they be the Baltics or Norway for that matter, are sufficiently hardened so that they are, keeping with the metaphor, prickly enough such that Russia might choose not to take a bite, just as that German shepherd won't ever do again. This strategy changes the role of those frontline member states within NATO's defense posture, becoming a bit more Article 3, denial, and a bit less Article 5, punishment, more, as Article 3 says, to maintain and develop their individual and collective capacity to resist armed attack, rather than simply holding on and waiting 4 or 5 weeks or so for the punishing punch of the biggest member state finally to be delivered. The hardening of the rim states could, I have argued, include developing strong cyber defenses, the use of new forms of sensors, and the development of a robust civil defense system. much like the one a Scowcroft Center delegation saw on a visit to Norway just last month. But newer technologies provide the rim states even more tools, as we will hear from TX. Arguably, this approach may be more difficult than the crumpled bumper roll, but not only would it likely be more palatable for those states most at risk than simply to take that punch and hold on, it might also be cheaper, and it conveniently fits with the United States' strenuous insistence on precisely this, more self-defense. Most importantly, it may very well be a more effective way to deter the most likely form of Russian aggression. Today we call it hybrid warfare, than simply to say, just you wait till my big brother gets here. This hybrid form of warfare relies upon, we all know, it is not a full frontal assault, but is instead Russia's strategic use of all means of coercion short of the classic form of explosive warfare NATO is set up for, what Dr. Hamas has called 4G warfare, utilizing all available networks, which include hard-to-see tactics such as strategic, economic, and energy coercion, as well as political coercion along with sophisticated disinformation attacks, and now the application of dangerous technology such as cyber. And soon, likely, it will also include even more sophisticated ones still, like bio and nano in the 5th generation of warfare, all softening the terrain to permit the bear to saunter over the border. How to defend against this sophisticated but non-explosive form of aggression provides our segue into TX's talk on the porcupine defense in the Baltics, or how small frontline European states can employ emerging technology to defend against Russia. I am reminded to remind you to join the electronic conversation on Twitter by following @Atlantic Council and @AC Scowcroft and using the hashtag AC Defense. With that, TX, thank you.
Good morning, and thanks for coming out this morning. I'd also like to thank the Atlantic Council and Barry in particular. We started this project a couple months ago and came to what I hope will be a different approach for the frontline states as well as the other states of Europe to support this. Perhaps the most famous quote in Thucydides' masterwork, The Peloponnesian Wars, comes from the Melian dialogue. When the Athenians, who are being bullies, go to the Melians and say, the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. Eastern Europe has a similar problem. They've got a large neighbor who thinks they should be in charge, and they have to figure out some way to discourage them. Unfortunately, 2,000 years, the millennium problem has existed, and now we may finally have a solution to it. The fourth industrial revolution is providing options that will allow for deterrence both through denial and defense. Now, like any good plan or operational discussion, you need to start with assumptions. I'm going to give you 6 assumptions I use. This is not all of them, but these are the key ones. The conflict will commence from a standing start. There will be very little warning time. The idea that we're going to mobilize large forces from Western Europe or from the United States is not realistic. NATO forces are not going to be much larger than they are today. NATO nations will continue to disagree about whether the primary threat is from Russia or the primary threat is from mass migration from the south. Both will consume resources. NATO will only have tripwire forces in the frontline states. They will not be able to turn back a Russian conventional invasion. Reserve forces cannot be trained to regular standards simply due to a lack of time and resources. And frontline states are aware that some NATO nations will not respond. So with those as the assumptions, what are the key conditions we've got? Well, first condition that's most important is European willingness and readiness. In willingness measure, I used the polling data. In 2015, a Carnegie Europe poll asked if nations should defend an ally. Only 48% of Europeans thought they should. In the same year, Wynne Gallup asked the question differently and asked, would you personally be willing to fight to defend your nation, not an ally, your nation? 25% said yes. Now, while this may change in the passion of war, the fact is that in the work up to war, with that kind of approval rating, you don't have the money to build the resources you need. So while they may be willing to fight when it happens, they won't have anything to fight with. And that brings us to capability. Currently, the United Kingdom can probably put out 1 brigade. If they strain, they may get a 2nd brigade out. Germany, in 2017, had a grand total of 95 operational Leopard tanks, and they were not the newest version. and only 29 infantry fighting vehicles. 0 submarines. They never short 21,000 officers in their armed forces. Now, recently, reports show they're better. They've got 2 submarines up, so they're 1/3 readiness in their fleet. Their aircraft and tanks are at 40%, which would be totally unacceptable in almost any organization except an F-35 organization. And they also are not the updated versions. Finally, the logistic networks, despite a lot of talk and a lot of effort in that direction, they really cannot support major deployment from Western Europe to Eastern European states. The railroad networks simply are insufficient to do that. The second problem is NATO's unity or NATO's position on this. There's no question when RAND study says that if we have 7 heavy brigades in the Baltic states, or 7 brigades, 3 of them heavy, we would be able to cause the delay long enough for our forces to get there. The problem is with this division in NATO opinion, whether the threat is Russians or from the south, there is not going to be the money to do that. The other reason there won't be money to do that is that the Trump administration's America First causes a great deal of confusion. It is rarely clarified by tweets. In fact, we don't know exactly what we're going to do or what resources we'll have to do it. And finally, the third big thing is that geography allows a fait accompli attack. The distances from the border to the coast is so short that the Russians are confident they can probably get there in 48 to 72 hours, and therefore we won't have time to respond. At that point, they go into their method of threaten to escalate to de-escalate. And then the European states have to ask, do we really want to fight for the Baltics if there's a possibility of the use of tactical nuclear weapons? So with that, I'll go into some good news for a change. What emerging technologies we have that could do this, which mixed with old and updated technology could provide an affordable solution where we would talk about whether you're creating an effective defense rather than whether you're spending 2%, which is a really rather ridiculous measure. What's the emerging technology? Well, first off, it's task-specific AI. I'm not talking general AI. I'm talking task-specific. Can you go to this location, find this target, and drive into it? That technology exists. And it exists in cheap drones. We know this because in 2014, a University of Virginia professor was asked, could he 3D print a drone that was autonomous? And he did so. He 3D printed a drone. He put in a couple of batteries he got on the internet, put a little electric motor from the internet, borrowed one of his students' cell phones, and wired it up. It has a theoretical range of 50 kilometers. They've flown it that long. They've only flown it 20 kilometers one direction because the student insists he wants his cell phone back. So they keep getting it back. But that's interesting. It means that you've got a cheap, fairly long-range system. Since 2014, battery density has improved dramatically. You could probably get 100 kilometers out of that system. Then the question of autonomy, that's a whole separate question. But the fundamental question is man on the loop or man in the loop, or human on the loop, human in the loop. But those are both failed systems. So having a discussion between 2 failed systems, I think, is fundamentally immoral. And you should be looking for a solution that admits the human will start the loop, which we've been doing for decades, if not centuries. And how do we make it work that way? But that we can have that discussion Q&A. The second thing that's happening is small warheads that will make them deadly. A warhead the size of my thumb, weighing less than 3 ounces, will punch through a 1/2 inch of steel using an explosively formed projectile. That means something as light as that drone the UVA professor built could stop any logistics vehicle, any truck. Also, almost any box of rockets sitting on top of a truck, you fire into it, you'll get a secondary off the fuel and ammunition. Fuel trucks are also there. Any aircraft parked on the ground is obviously a victim to these things. So you have the possibility. So now you've got a few autonomous drones. So what? Well, what's changed is that in 2014, when the professor printed his drone, it took him 24 hours, almost 28 when he did the assembly. But reality is, since then, carbon 3D printing has developed a system that is at least 100 times faster. We've seen that demonstrated in public. He claims he's getting to 200. So one printer prints you 100 drones. Well, if you have a fair-sized printing plant, say like UPS is building. UPS thinks printing is going to drive shipping underground. So they're building plants to print the parts themselves. They've got a 100 printer plant up and running in Tennessee. They're expanding it to 1,000. They're building them in Singapore. They're building them in Germany. So if you have a 100 printer plant, that's 10,000 cheap drones per day. If you have 1,000, it's 100,000 cheap drones per day for the cost of less than an average artillery round. So this is the option you've got. Longer range, you can go after enemy airfields, rail lines, etc. There are commercial drones out there more expensive, obviously. The flex rotor is an expensive drone, about $150,000, $200,000 a copy, but it goes 2,000 miles autonomously. The Voland's Eye, 500 miles at a top speed of 200 miles an hour, delivering 20 pounds. The Israelis have had the Harpy drone in operation for 10 years. It's now in 6 air forces. It goes 600 miles, which, by the way, outranges the F-35, and hunts autonomously. So this is a possibility for going deeper. Then updated technology, cruise missiles we've had for a long time, but with advanced manufacturing, primarily 3D printing and robotics, we're bringing down the price of satellites by 40% per satellite. We can probably do the same for cruise missiles. We're also developing new families of cruise missiles in Connex boxes. We're only a few years behind the Russians and the Chinese on this. The Russian Caliber class goes 250 nautical miles in hunting a ship, the anti-ship cruise missile. When it has a fixed target, land attack is 1,500 miles. The Marine Corps is building the Zephyr. Within a couple of years, they will have a Connex box-mounted weapon that will go 1,500 miles against a land target and about 250 against a sea target. It's much cheaper than air forces, obviously more survivable, and gives you immediate long-range response. One of our problems is we won't enter the contested zone because of the A2AD the Russians have built there. We don't want to put manned aircraft in there. But if we're firing drones that are much cheaper than the missiles they're firing back, we can expend their magazine and then have free reign. And you can do it immediately. You don't have to wait for the 2-week campaign to take down the IADs. And the old tech is mines and improvised explosive devices. Well, you can look down on IED. We haven't solved that problem in 18 years. They're still killing Americans with these things. And if you think differently, if you're in the defense and you're part of a state, you can go from IEDs, the small ones that flip vehicles over, to larger ones like an explosively formed projectile that kills M1 tanks. If you're really creative, you think, hey, a 20-foot container filled with ammonium nitrate is a 50,000-pound IED. And imagine you're the armored column that runs into one of those. Well, the first company doesn't really care because they're not around anymore. Now you got to convince the second company they want to try. And if they hit one, then you've really got a problem in getting your guys to go. So what's the operational concept? As I said, it's a porcupine defense, deny Russian invasion through attrition and punishment. What can nations do, small nations? Well, the first is engineering prep. There's a lot of restrictive terrain up in these states. Now, it changes with the weather, so this is where the reserves are very important because they know trafficability in various parts of the nation at different times of the year. But if you use a program like the Koreans did to create barrier plans coming into South Korea, you can greatly fortify the defense. Also, the money you spend goes to local construction companies. So it's not a sunk cost in terms of you just spend it on ammunition and nobody ever uses it. You actually get to use the equipment, etc. You reorganize your reserves. The military forces stay pretty much where they are. They start to adopt this cruise missiles in boxes. They start to adopt lots of drones in cans, things like that. But the reserves can do this too. That allows for immediate deployment. Rather than going to reserve center, drawing my weapons, getting in formation, trying to get trained up in a short period of time, you simply take your small team, you get the ammonium nitrate explosive, which is your base explosive, and by the way, millions of tons of ammonium nitrate are shipped through the Baltics every year, a lot of it coming out of Russia, but they also have their own farming supplies. You draw your ammonium nitrate, you draw your detonator from your company commander, it's kept safe at home, because ammonium nitrate is totally safe until it's got a detonator. And you go out and set your explosives. And this can be anything I said, like from small explosives to big ones, up to 50,000 pounds. You disperse widely. The number one problem, the number one killer for the Russians has always been artillery. Anytime you put a reserve unit in one place, they will find you and probably kill you in a mass fire strike. It's kind of hard to waste volleys of artillery against 2 or 3 guys out in the woods. You offset fire your drones, again, out of commercial containers. And why commercial containers? Because it's very, very hard to preempt. I can't kill every 20-foot container in the Baltic States. I can't kill every white delivery van or white box van. But if you build your systems to go easily in and out of there, a couple things happen. One, all of your civilian commercial handling equipment can be mobilized. You have the drivers trained, you have the equipment there, and you simply create too many targets. The other thing is warehouses are designed to take these in and out. So if I want to hide them, I run them in and out of warehouses, garages, etc. And then, if it's going to work, you have to have an aggressive information campaign. Deterrence doesn't do any good if I don't know it's there. So what I would do is once a year, run an exercise where the reserves move to their positions, set up an IED field, detonate it, invite Russian observers. Each year, somebody would do a 50,000-pound canister Connex box. That one would register. And then fire 100 drones or so that lift out of their canisters, fly at the border, and then turn around at the border. Some will fly into a range and detonate to show they work. Others will just return silently. What would worry the Russians about this is no emissions. Because they're autonomous, I'm not communicating with them. And that's the way the Russians have successfully killed the drones in Syria, is mostly electronic warfare. The other thing that's interesting is commercial firms are very interested in non-GPS dependent navigation for drones, and they're going to get it very quickly. There's 5 different techniques. They're progressing quickly. That's important because now you can't jam my GPS either. I have a sealed drone. You don't have an electronic path into it. So what are the advantages? Again, I mobilize in hours, not days. So I overcome that geographic problem. I can actually mobilize faster than the Russians can. I don't try to train my reservists to fight armored forces. As an infantryman for 30 years, I can tell you that is a near impossible task, to train light infantry to take on armor, even in rough terrain. Again, it can't preempt. Same for cruise missiles. One of the advantages here is if the Western European nations also buy these long-range cruise missiles, then you don't have to worry about trying to ship over a network which can't handle it. If they're in 20-foot containers, every transportation network in every nation can handle 20-foot containers. You can move them forward. Or you can actually fire them from your own home territory at fixed targets. So you would have immediate reinforcement, massively cheaper than buying F-35s and flying F-35s. So the key thing is this is all cheaper than upgrading and defending 20th century weapons systems. And that's important because, as I said, there doesn't seem to be much appetite for spending significantly more money. So it deters. Why? Any bear can eat any porcupine, but they don't. Okay, thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome again to the Atlantic Council. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm a Senior Vice President here and the Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and this is where we're ramping up a lot of our defense work, as Mr. Shapiro said earlier. So we're going to have a nice little conversation about how we prevent World War III here this morning, or one of the many ways that we can harness the explosion of technology in the commercial sector globally, combine that with novel operational concepts, and help to deter and, if necessary, defend our allies wherever they may be situated. So wanted to have a really good conversation. We'll turn to you for your questions and suggestions on this after we initially hear from our panelists. You know Dr. Hammes now. Let me also introduce Dr. Kathleen McGinnis, who is a frequent and active participant with our program today. She's a non-resident senior fellow. Dr. Richard Hooker, who's at National Defense University, but was the senior director for Europe on the National Security Council staff, so has a lot of very current and deep knowledge on these questions. And we also have Mr. Roland Henninch, who serves as the defense counselor at the Embassy of Latvia. This literally hits home with him, and so we really want to hear the perspective from the region. And so I might actually start with Mr. Henninch. Roland, how does all this sound to you? Would this concept that has been outlined here today, including 3D printed drones and IEDs, do you think this would enhance the deterrent efforts of your country and and other regional allies? How do you think this all would play, and is it feasible and desirable from your government's and your personal point of view? Thanks for coming too.
Well, first of all, I would like to start by thanking Atlantic Council and my colleagues here on the panel for raising issues of Baltic security. But also I have to say up front that I see a fundamental problem with this report. Well, the thing is that we don't have porcupines in Baltics. and you cannot use the symbol of animal which nobody has seen in real life. So that might be difficult. And exactly, but there's a fix, because we have a very similar animal to porcupine, which is hedgehog.
Okay.
It's a little bit smaller, but still and nicer as well, I would say. But it knows how to defend itself, and when in danger, it rolls into small ball and puts its spines out so that nobody wants to touch it. The only issue with our hedgehogs is that they sleep 6 months a year. But as we know, Russians probably would not attack us during the winter time anyway. So I think we are safe to use hedgehog as a symbol of our resistance.
We'll put that out in version 2.0 of this concept.
But said that, I'm actually not joking about hedgehogs, because this allegation is being used lately in Latvia, at least quite often, looking at our defense strategy and how we should ensure deterrence, which is our main aim. So main aim is deterrence, and then comes defense. Because we have seen this resurgent Russia on our borders, and we have 170-mile border with Russia and 100-mile border with Belarus as well. We've seen that over the years, and we have this. We understand that we have a time and space problem, looking globally from alliance point of view. And we have understood that in any scenario we will be the first responders, and we need to step up our defense efforts. And actually we did. What we have done in past years is just to name few things. Of course, we raised our budget to 2%, which is, I agree, it's not the solution itself, but at least it's an indicator, and it helps to get some capabilities. Last year, for example, we spent around 45% on investment, buying new things or building new things, and we have invested in those spines or quills over the years, being anti-tank weapons, air defense weapons, our own mobility platforms, counter-mobility platforms, special operation forces, tried to decentralize command of our forces, and we have changed the way how we approach the war fighting, how we see the potential of the conflict. Just to name few examples, when it comes to our decision making and action, we have even amended the legislation, for example, to change the definition of war. What is war? So now, if there's armed aggression, even in the form of hybrid warfare, it still can be considered a war. So we don't have to wait for a letter from Mr. Putin saying that he's at war. We have changed the law also that now it's illegal to give orders not to resist. So basically, orders or unwillingness to resist are illegal. Well, that dates back to the notorious history we had in 1940s. So we don't want the repetition of that. So that's why this change. And in cases if our leadership is impeded to or paralyzed to make decisions, there's authority to armed forces actually to act on their own without higher command, of course based on pre-approved plans and based on indicators and warnings. But the most important thing we have understood over the years is that the first thing we have to safeguard is the will of people to fight, to resist. And we have seen this foreign malign influence for last decades, basically since we regained independence, falling on us and trying to diminish the role, diminish let's say the willingness, downplay allied assistance role or willingness of NATO. So we have to assure our own population, first of all, that our country is defendable and it will be defended. And here I would actually like to praise Dr. Hams for his report, for his study, because it at least offers solutions and shows the ways that with strategy and with will of people, will of armed forces, you can deter, you can defend. And here we have actually gone a long way, and I know that many like to quote 2016 RAND study which basically said that without 7 additional brigades, you are doomed in less than 60 hours, which is not true. By seizing some territory, well, you cannot win the war. It's not the end, it's just the start of the conflict. The phase changes. If you look now in 2019, we have commonly became more innovative, more proactive. The same RAND has produced a study about unconventional warfare, which suggests that with some minor investments and also with some smart strategy, actually you can deter and cause some damage to potential adversary, which he will not be ready to accept. Then you have also this Swedish FOI Institute, which made a study about Russian A2AD bubbles, trying to challenge our perception that basically the very term A2AD means that it's something something you cannot access or something where you will not be able to operate. But they try to demystify that and challenge our perception that it's something very homogeneous and closed, really bubble of systems, and that there are ways how, with some good approach, we can actually change and challenge those bubbles. And there are more. And we of course welcome this change of mindset and these new ideas, but at the same time I want to emphasize that for us deterrence consists of at least 3 pillars. One is our own national ability to defend, to resist, and resilience of our society, whole government approach, and we are now changing our let's say social contract with society, so that everybody has a role or has to be defense minded in Latvia, and so that's one element. Another element is readiness and ability to reinforce by our allies, by NATO. If we believe in collective defense, and we do, so that's the pillar we need to strengthen, and we in our strategy rely on that, because with all the spines and everything, still bear can eat the small hedgehog or porcupine, so we can make it painful for him, but we cannot win the war alone if we get so far. And the third pillar is allied presence, and I would argue that's even more important now. Call it tripwire, call it as you want, but it's very important now while we work on those 2 previous pillars or strands of war, while we rapidly develop our own capabilities, fine-tune our own concepts, and NATO increases its readiness and reinforcement mechanisms. So and also within this our own capability development, I would argue that of course we have to focus on new and innovative solutions, but at the same time I would say it should be mixed still of all old good conventional capabilities like air defense, anti-tank, artillery weapons, and new innovative solutions like artificial intelligence, drones, offensive cyber, etc. So, but within this, I would say, if I may characterize this as unconventional warfare, what was discussed here, of course, seeking for new innovative solutions, just like this report or study sees, I would see that as very encouraging and good basis for further analysis.
Great, thank you very much. We'll want to come back to you for a few more thoughts and questions on other issues. I want to turn to Kathleen now. Thanks again for coming, Kathleen. How do you think this concept might fit into NATO's overall approach for deterrence and defense? And certainly looking back in history, there have always been sort of new breakthroughs in operational concepts that have led to significant battlefield effectiveness. And then even today, we do see a lot of experimentation and concept development even in the US military establishment. So I'm just trying to sort of put this in context. It's not just some wild, crazy idea that no one should be thinking about. This comes in both a historical context as well as a context where the Defense Department of the United States is undertaking very vigorous efforts to harness the explosion of commercial technology in Silicon Valley and elsewhere and incorporate it into our defense capabilities for the era of great power competition. So over to you. Sorry, I could go on and on.
Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you, TX, for putting together this really creative paper. Taking the fourth industrial revolution and applying it to this problem, I just found my brain spinning, and it's just wonderful food for thought and a wonderful starting point, as you said, for further analysis. I should mention my day job is at the Congressional Research Service, and so I'm here in my private capacity, and nothing I say is representative of the United States government or the CRS, and so I can speak a bit more candidly. But so with that caveat, so the points of reflection that I was asked to speak to today were really focused on what does this mean for NATO? What does this mean for the way it thinks about operations? What it thinks about bigger strategic questions like cost sharing, burden sharing, so on and so forth. So, and I really found this paper as really a really great invitation to be able to do so. The first point that I thought was interesting, we speaking to this question of how rapid a NATO allied response would be in these contingencies. And looking back, a lot of these issues have revolved around NATO decision making. How does NATO take a decision in these kinds of crises and conflicts? Is the alliance at its current size now too large to be able to take a decision of this nature and magnitude in sufficient time to be able to do so, to be able to have an impact? Or are these battlefield circumstances going to play out before NATO really can get involved? And this has been going back many, many years. And it struck me that actually, with a lot of these crises that we've experienced over the past 25 years, it's generally been a mini-lateral coalition of NATO states, sometimes NATO states and non-NATO states, going in and addressing the crisis, being that spearhead force, and then NATO comes in afterwards. But there's a tension there, right? How do you have NATO's allied solidarity? How do you have Article 5 at the same time with a small subset of NATO performing these operations and being the spearhead force? And so that to me is one of the dimensions of all of this that we need to really think through more carefully. How do we, if mini-lateral coalitions are the de facto way we are doing business, well, how do we integrate that into our overall operational approach, and how do we make sure that it doesn't undermine overall NATO solidarity? So that's one dimension of this. The other dimension that I thought was really interesting about this, you speak to these lower cost solutions using fourth industrial revolution technologies. Yet our metrics for allied strategic cohesion are about inputs and defense spending, right? So how does this fit into that overall conversation? And maybe it could be a useful entry point into shifting the conversation away from 2% and how you're spending it and all these inputs, and to think and frame those in terms of cost sharing, so we can actually get back to the normative strategic conversation about burden sharing. What does it mean as allies to grapple with these strategic challenges together? How do we morally and normatively reinforce each other? That's what, when NATO was stood up, that was a key part of the discussion. Allies knew that they didn't have the capabilities necessary to deter Russia at the time. But the normative and moral dimensions of and the values that we stood for as a NATO alliance were so critical to the formation and the cohesion of the alliance itself. Can we get ourselves back to that discussion, especially given the strategic competition relative to authoritarian states that we're now facing? And could this be a way to help us get there? I thought that was absolutely fascinating. So congratulations on a wonderful paper. Thank you so much for putting it together.
Thanks, Kathleen. Dr. Hooker, I want to turn to you last but not least. What's your overall thought on this concept? How does it fit in more than almost anyone here on this panel? You know the general trajectory of U.S. leadership in NATO right now and what's going on both operationally, politically, and in other domains. So your points here would be particularly valuable.
Well, thank you, Barry, and it's always a pleasure to spar with TX. I'd like to start by commending TX and also the Council for drawing attention to the Baltic region, which I think is one of the biggest national and international security challenges that's in play right now. The Council has been doing this for some years now, and I think rightly so. TX probably in a way has been a sort of a voice crying in the wilderness for at least 10 years now, if not more, in arguing that our fascination with, the few, the exquisite, and the costly may not necessarily be the right way to go. And certainly the advent of this exciting technology, which is evolving at such a rapid pace, is something that he's right to argue we need to pay close attention to. It's changing and roiling a lot of service cultures in our own country and in other services. But that's the price of getting better, I think. So because he's shining a light on that, I think he performs a very valuable service there. I would support almost everything that TX says in his paper up to a point. So if you're a Baltic defense planner like Roland, although you're meeting the 2% goal, your defense budget is still quite small. And much of that's got to go to salaries and to other personnel costs. So your ability to make capital investments is not large. And to be honest, the Allies haven't done much for the Balts in that regard. Of the $15 billion or so that's been appropriated to date for the European Deterrence Initiative, EDI, virtually none of that has gone to the Baltic states. And other wealthy countries like Germany have really not done much in the way of security assistance. So the Balts have been left to their own devices, and their resources are scarce. So if you can stretch $1 or €1 in the way that TX describes, that can only be a good thing. And I would say the Baltic militaries are not embarrassed by these entrenched service cultures. So they're in some ways more free to adapt this new technology or these new approaches because they don't have to push against, decades of service history and tradition and culture. So that's kind of an exciting thing there. Now, having said all of that, if you think that this alone is going to deter the Russian Federation from aggressing for reasons that make sense to them, I would submit that you're off the mark. So when the Pentagon says the Porcupine defense is all you need, the Pentagon is mistaken. If you just get down into a close analysis of combat ratios, of terrain, of time distance factors, right? The meat of what a real military planner has to do, it quickly becomes apparent that there's a big problem to be met here. Everything that TX talks about, if implemented, would significantly increase the cost on an invading force. There's no doubt about that. Could it stop it or even materially slow it? I have very real doubts. The Russians have such an advantage in size and geographical proximity. They've got a well-developed doctrine. Every major think tank in Washington has looked at this problem in the last 3 or 4 years and come to the same conclusion, which is that the Baltic states will be overrun in short order unless the alliance does something about it. Now, what does that mean? Well, I think there are 2 parts to that. The first is that we need to think about ways to enable the Balts to hold out until NATO reinforcements can arrive. Right now, the studies suggest that the Baltic states could defend for 3 to 5 days, and it would be 3 to 4 months before NATO in any strength could get in. So we obviously have to work those 2 problems. For me personally, having spent a lot of time studying this problem, I think the first goal is to try to find a way to help the Balts defend for up to 30 days and impose significant cost on an invading force. And then we've got to get NATO in a posture where it can reinforce meaningfully at about the 30-day mark. I'll throw out one comment and then I'll stop talking, and that is that I, as much as anyone in the past few years, have been beating the burden sharing drum. I think the American people want to see evidence that our European allies are pulling their fair share of the weight. But let's be honest, European defense spending right now today is about $300 billion a year. more than 4 times what Russia spends on defense. I would suggest that the tougher problem, the more important problem, is how that money is spent. Almost across the board, as TX alluded to, the readiness of our allies is quite low, and it needs to be much better than it is. You need sizable forces fighting in the Baltic states in 30 days or less, not 90 or 120 days or less. The money is there to do that. The political will is not there to do that right now, and I think that's the fuel we need to be playing. So thank you, Barry.
Thanks, Rich. I want to go back to you right away and then turn to TX for his comments on the broader conversation. But what I wanted to go back to you on is, my own view is your depiction of the way the first 30 to 60 to 90 days seems a little generalized. In other words, while it would take 30 days or more for NATO to bring significant ground forces,
90 days.
90 days to bring significant ground forces. NATO has an enormous preponderance of air combat capability, and it wouldn't just be the Baltics. You're on your own. Sorry about that, but we'll bring forces. We'll bring ground forces in. I mean, we have naval fires and air combat capability that would be pummeling Russian forces, both at the front and behind the front. And I just wanted to get your take on. It's not quite you're on your own until 90 days.
Not quite, but first of all, we can't use naval forces inside the Baltic approaches because we're outranged by Russian anti-ship missiles and cruise missiles. We're well outranged. So any competent naval planner will tell you sailing surface ships into the Baltic Sea is a non-starter in the opening stages of the conflict. So could we lob some things at them from great range? Yes, we could. The Russians could play that game right now better than we can. When it comes to air power, NATO has got real advantages in air power. One of the problems is that you're not going to be able to get all the NATO allies to commit all of their air forces to this fight. The Russians probably can bring about 400 combat aircraft to bear in this kind of scenario that we're talking about, and about 150 attack helicopters. And we have to solve the problem of Kaliningrad, which is not an unsolvable problem, but it's a tough problem to solve in 2 to 4 weeks. It's a very dense, very capable air defense network that we have to do something about before we can fly with what anyone would consider to be acceptable losses. And what are the Russians doing in the first 15 to 30 days? Well, they're working hard to overrun the Baltic states. So time is really the critical factor here. And TX has given us some ways to buy time and to impose cost, which is a terrific thing, and it's a direction and approach that I really hope the Baltic states, NATO, and the United States works to try to bring into being. In and of itself won't be enough, though.
Okay, thanks. I think that kind of operational context is important for almost the entire rest of the conversation. TX, do you agree with everything that's been said, or you want to give a few thoughts on the conversation so far?
I agree with Rich that if you don't do this in a big way and relatively cheap compared to other ways, it doesn't stop the Russians. My problem is with your solution, Rich, is it's just not going to happen. There is no political will to do that. There is no political will to build up the forces. Even if you build up the forces, your point about NATO air power, airplanes on the ground are just waiting to die. And when the F-35 has a 500-mile range and the cruise missiles have a 1,500-mile range, you're getting hammered. Even our key enablers, AWACS, refuelers, et cetera, will be within range of Russian systems. That's something we haven't begun to deal with at all. The Army has nowhere near the budget to provide the air defense for those bases that they would need to. Now, one good thing about European aircraft being older is they can move around a lot. The F-35 is a pretty delicate flower. It has to be close to the ALIS system. There's maintenance that's very limited. The Navy just had to consolidate their 2 squadrons to get enough maintainers to get their readiness rate above 30%. So there's all of those problems with using NATO air. If instead of buying a F-35, you were to buy 100 cruise missiles, which is about the cost. And then keep in mind that because you don't fly the F-35, you don't need the pilot, you don't need the maintainers, you don't need the health care, you don't need the retirement, you don't need the airfield, you don't need the golf courses, you don't need the O-clubs. So could you buy 250, 300 cruise missiles? Kratos is offering a drone that's fully autonomous that will take 600 pounds, 2 small diameter bombs, 2 air-to-air missiles, 1,500 miles, vertical launch and recovery. They are literally packaging them in 20-foot containers. and they're working through the process. The Air Force has finally bought into this. They're actually buying 20 of these. They've got a request in for 20. So that gives this ability. You've got to do it in numbers too. I mean, when I say drones, when I say 100,000 drones, that's maybe 100,000 drones a day, or 10,000 drones a day. And if you're a Russian brigade commander and there are 10,000 active hunters, even if 20% of them go stupid, now there's only 8,000 hunting you. And if only 10% hit, that's 800 of your vehicles aren't working today. Can you sustain an attack when 800 of your logistic vehicles are out of action? And this isn't really hard AI. It's AI, fly to the Russian border. When you cross the Russian border, feel free to kill anything you see. We can keep it that simple. And that changes the dynamics. And then again, some of the Baltic states are leading in 3D printing. You can actually set these things up yourself and have the ability to run these at a fairly rapid rate. They can also be run very quickly. If put in 20-foot containers, are much easier to deploy forward. So it's a process that you work through, and what you've got to do is, I think this is affordable at 2%. I don't see any interest in going beyond 2% in Europe. And we won't get to where we want to go even if everybody goes to 2%. The other thing is you're reducing your manpower. As you've noted, they've got a huge budget and it's all for people. Can we convince them to cut the size of their forces by replacing it? For instance, the Marine Corps is looking at, rather than an infantry battalion, suppose you have a fires battalion. Well, that means rather than 950 Marines, you have about 300. But it also means instead of a range of 4,000 meters, you have a range of 1,500 miles. So it changes the dynamics dramatically. We've got to explore that, start experimenting with it, and see where the path takes us. Because I just don't think, I absolutely agree with you, that's what we need to defend. We're not going to get it.
I want to turn to the audience now. I have lots more questions, but I want to make sure I capture some of your questions and comments. And in particular, Mr. Harlan Ullman has also been a very long-term and sustained proponent of a porcupine defense. I haven't heard the word hedgehog out of his mouth, but porcupine certainly. And so I want to turn to him first, and then please let me know if you all others have questions too. Harlan.
TX is theoretically right. We've been working this at the Naval War College for 2.5 years. TX has been a firm supporter, looking not only in Europe but also in the Pacific. But the reality is, how are you going to get states to accommodate this? The bad news is we cannot reinforce. Let me say that again. We cannot reinforce. Trident Juncture has made that clear. So the notion of getting there 30, 60, 90 days, forget about that. The Russians or the Chinese are going to take out our logistics systems. For the past 4 years, I've been working with great unsuccess, trying to implement porcupine defense in 2 NATO countries on the flanks, with the full support of the Chief of Defense Staff in both cases. In one case, this particular country is allocating $10 billion to procurement to buy American systems to try and make itself closer to the United States. The real issue is that conventional militaries like to fly airplanes, sail ships, and look like the American Army, and that's not going to work. The larger problem is that Lockheed Martin doesn't make $10 drones. Global Hawks run, if you include R&D, about $250 million a pop. And so the whole notion that TX wants to see here is something that flies in the face of the defense industrial complexes. No big company wants to have a program of record for less than 10 or $20 billion. And so the issue here, first of all, we have the Russians who have got no intent or reason of wanting to invade the Baltics, no matter what Americans may think, or in the Black Sea. They want to intimidate other things. This is simply not going to happen. You just have to speak to the Russians at the highest levels and read what they're writing. But TX is right. You need to have some kind of deterrent, whether it's a hedgehog or a porcupine. You want some poisonous pills. We could do this on the cheap. We have Eastern European countries that have tremendous intellectual and human capital that could do this very, very simply. But the problem is, how do you get presidents and prime ministers to change their views? And in the 2 countries in which I work very, very closely, it was the politics that made this impossible. And so as a result, one country has a submarine as a museum and is buying stuff that's antiquated at best and could easily have transitioned to along the lines of what TX is saying, but with even far more capacity and capability, because TX has not really quite scratched the surface on other things that can be done. And so the issue here in NATO is that we have a theoretical solution. I understand everything that Rich is saying, but we have a theoretical solution that politically needs to be implemented. The question is, how do you break the political logjam in these particular countries? And I think that's the impossible issue. The good news is we're not going to go to war with Russia, but that still does not give us sufficient reassurance.
Yeah. TX, can you address that? And my own view on scenarios is we need to be really modest about our ability to predict things. If you had said in January of 2011 NATO would be flying air operations over Libya, people would have said you're crazy. 2 months later, they were flying air operations over Libya. Russia may not invade out of the blue, but the chances of a crisis, look what happened in the South China Sea with the ships almost colliding. We just don't know.
We never had a very out of business when NATO was out of area.
I think this is one of the rare cases where I'm an optimist. Generally, I'm fairly pessimistic about this stuff. But the fact is that admirals and generals like shiny stuff. So they want the latest airplane, but they want the latest American airplane. The fact the U.S. Air Force is starting to talk about loyal wingmen and starting to buy Kratos. You're right, Boeing can't build a cheap one. The cheap drone Boeing is building for Australia is $12 million a pop. Kratos is offering for $2 million because Kratos is a company, a defense company, but it's built cheap throwaway stuff since it started. So its cost structure is set up under the innovator's dilemma problem. If your cost structure is set up for expensive stuff, you can't build cheap stuff. Kratos has built cheap stuff, so they'll probably bring it in around $2 million a copy. The other thing that works is through history, the process for changing either operational concepts or military equipment is first it starts out as an assistant or a helper. The airplane can find the enemy fleet over the horizon. It's not particularly useful, but it can find the fleet so the battleships can kill the enemy fleet. That's 1920. By the mid-30s, the airplane has progressed to the point it's an equal partner, and you see the mid-30s naval exercises where you have carrier striking and battleship striking. And then by 42, of course, the carriers replace the battleship. That pattern goes for muskets replacing pikes, a whole series of things through history. We're on that path, and if the U.S. leads, we can. Now, interesting, the Marine Corps is looking very heavily at this, despite the Marine Corps loving to be an infantry force. The cruise missile, the fires type operations with mobile fires is kind of the direction they're going. I mean, that's what they've published, and that's where they're putting some of their money. The problem is it's hit the ball, drag the F-35, hit the ball, drag the F-35, and that's what's consuming your money. If more stuff continues to fall off, maybe we will begin to say we don't need 2,400 of these. Because the problem with the program is you never know if you're reading an Onion headline or a GAO report when you read about the F-35. So I think that it will be necessarily a slow progress. It'll take a decade or two. The other thing that will encourage it is that this is moving so fast into the civilian world. Nobody would have said 10 years ago, oh, we'll be thinking about drone delivery from LA to San Francisco in 2 hours autonomously. And now they're looking for the permission to do it. And they're starting to fly this. People are going to start saying, why does it cost me so many people and so much money to run an Air Force drone when these guys are doing it autonomously? And I think that will drive us that direction. And like you said, there's a huge resource in Eastern Europe for inexpensive manufacture. 3D manufacturing can be relatively inexpensive and everybody's moving into it. It's light industry, it's not heavy industry, so you don't have the pollution problems. It's really positive in it. When it's not building weapons, it can build all kinds of other things. So there's a real encouragement there for small nations to move into this field. I think all of those things will come together. The question is not whether they can overcome military-industrial, but political military-industrial. And as long as there's huge amounts of money pumping into American politics, I'm not sure we get there. We're beginning to move there. I'm not sure, I don't know enough about European politics, maybe you can get there easier.
Rollins.
On these days and months, what we usually count, how long we will resist, I just want to say that we in our Baltic region, we have quite good history with resistance. Even if you look back to 13th century, we were last pagans resisting German crusaders, so still the last white spot on the Christianity map. And then, of course, after Second World War, there were forest brothers which were fighting still more than a decade in Baltic forests after Soviet Union occupied the Baltic states, and they were crashed only then when it became clear for Soviet Union that there will be no military action or from NATO or from Western countries. So I think we shouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past and shouldn't wait while conflict becomes reality and then try to think about the ways how we can help each other. But really provide some assistance to Baltics already before the crisis. So everything which goes to pre-planned action, pre-positioned, war materials, equipment, we should be doing that now to avoid bad situations later. Because, as it was said, Baltic defense budgets, even if they reach 2%, on larger scale, they are not comparable with other countries, and of course with Russian budget. So there needs to be some add-on to actually strengthen the capabilities of Baltic countries. And on UAV capabilities, you're right. In the Baltics, we have this UAV market is rapidly growing. Some companies are already competing on global scale. I recently learned actually that one of the companies provides programming for drones which fly over the Napa Valley vineyards. So even things like that. I would just say another thing which I would see from what we would expect from U.S. Military, U.S. politics point of view, to be in Baltics. With this new concept of dynamic force employment, I would wish to see it more trained and employed in Baltic region, sending larger formations over for exercises, more rotational presence, and then learn from that, and based on lessons learned from that, just adapt infrastructure or plans and procedures.
Great. A couple more questions, but I also wanted to sort of add to some reality and take us to a different region, and that is the Asia Pacific, where China, I'm not as clear on how Russia is moving in this sphere, but I do know that China is adopting these types of technologies and moving pretty quickly, in addition to having the world's largest domestic drone manufacturing base. And so I want to get thoughts from the panel, in terms of potential U.S. And potential adversaries of the U.S. and the U.S.'s allies. We do see some adoption of these types of technologies on a pretty dramatic basis. I think the last thing I saw, the reporting I saw even last week, was a whole concept of Chinese use of UUVs, unmanned underwater vehicles, almost like an unmanned base underwater, where UUVs are sent out and programmed to do a lot of military tasks. But I want to make sure we have a sort of a reality check that this isn't pie in the sky, that this is being adopted on, these types of things are being adopted by some of our potential adversaries.
Yeah, I think I've been looking at that closely. Probably the next paper I'm going to write is on that. The key thing is we're seeing one of those fundamental shifts in the character of war, not the nature, but the character. And we're seeing one of those shifts, I think, like we saw between 1863 and the U.S. Civil War and 1917, where the defense becomes tactically dominant. If you stuck your head above the ground, somebody shot you. So we ended up with the trench warfare of World War I. We're beginning to get that mutually denied zone, but that zone is getting to be 500 to 1,000 miles deep. That favors us, because we're on the defense both in Europe and in Asia, and if you can deny a zone, I don't care if we use the South China Sea. China needs it. We can get by without it. So if we can mutually deny that, then that's a huge advantage for us. And I think that's got to be more of an acceptance. There's an inherent want in the American armed forces. We're on the offensive because attack is the only way to win. But in fact, that may not be true anymore. If a defense is dominant tactically, you still win by being offensive operationally and strategically, but you got to rethink everything. Force structure, training, education, alliances. And alliances can buy into this. Again, if we buy in, the Japanese are actually leading us with anti-ship cruise missiles. They still have 5 regiments left over from defeating the Russians' idea, and they're now moving them down south to use them against the Chinese and upgrading.
Very, very, very interesting. Other thoughts from the panel? Yeah, Kathleen.
Sorry, just thinking about the Allied response and U.S. posture, I guess I'm just reminded of some of the lessons that we learned from the Cold War and how we did deterrence during the Cold War, which was, we had between 300,000 to 400,000 troops stationed in Europe to communicate that Americans had a skin in the game in the event of a Soviet incursion, and that if Europe was attacked, that America would immediately be a part of the response. And so, as I think about all these questions, having American presence forward may be a pretty critical element to all of this. It's not just technologies. It's not just how we adopt them. It's not just the operational concepts. It's also the people, the signals, the presence, that our troops and our posture has demonstrated that enable all of these things to occur. And so I think that's probably an important dimension of all of this to keep in mind.
Very good point.
So I think that's right. I often try to say the problem is really, not how would we defend the Baltic states, how would we win a fight with the Russian Federation on NATO's eastern flank. The real problem is how to deter that sort of conflict so that we never have to actually engage with them. We're talking about a great nuclear power here. The same is true with China. Doesn't have the capabilities that we have, but in a way it doesn't matter. It can threaten an unacceptable degree of punishment. So you always have to be thinking about that dimension when you think about these scenarios, right? The real problem is, how do we successfully defer? And to be credible, you need to have some of your own folks there or very nearby. In 1980, if we had told the West Germans, listen, we don't want there to be any doubt in your mind. We are here for you. We are committed to the defense of your territory, and we're committed to Article 5. It's ironclad. But that Russian artillery is really scary. So I'll tell you what, we're going to line up behind the Rhine, but we don't want you to worry. We will be there for you when you need us. Well, we would have been laughed off the continent because it's an absurd notion. We're not too far from there right now. Just from the western Polish border to the Lithuanian border is almost 900 kilometers, about as far as Napoleon went to Moscow. So we're not talking about small distances here. So anything that we can put forward is going to enhance deterrence. It's going to mean that our ability to train and signal and message with our allies is better and stronger, and deterrence is going to be better. And these are some of the things that we need to be thinking about. Although there's a disinclination, I admit, right now to think about them.
But in order to be deterred, you also have to be capable. You can line up 1,000 fighters on Kadena Air Base, and the Chinese won't be bothered because they're dying in their opening minutes of the war. So it's not a deterrent, it's just a sump. If, on the other hand, you had 1,000 Kratos distributing canisters all over Japan, so there's no way to preempt them, and they know if they do something to us, the response is 1,000 drones coming at them almost immediately, that's a different thing. So I'm absolutely convinced blood in the game is important. They've got to be forward deployed, but they've also got to be survivable forward deployed. They can't be tethered goats.
Question from Dr. Hans Binnendijk.
Thank you. TX, always great to
Good to see you again.
hear you and your creative ideas. We do have a serious deterrence gap problem in the alliance. We can't hold out long enough. Takes too long to reinforce. And you have given us some creative ideas to deal with the first part of that, to be able to hold out a bit longer. My concern in all of this, and I agree with Harlan, first of all, Putin would be crazy to do this. But, as Barry said, incidents take place, and so we have to be prepared and we have to maximize deterrence. I think there are some other things we can be doing as well to deal with this deterrence problem. We can rely in part on TX's suggestions, but we have, I've visited all three of the battle groups in the Baltic states. They can't hold out for long the way they are now, but they are integrated into local brigades. They need more ISR, they need distance fires, long-range fires, they need air defense. So there's a lot that we can do to increase the capabilities of the NATO forces that are forward deployed now. We ought to have some American boots on the ground, incidentally, in the Baltic states. Air power, Barry mentioned. I think you're right. Air power is part of the answer to dealing with this deterrence gap problem. Here there's this new readiness initiative, which focuses to a large degree on air power, 30 squadrons. We ought to be pushing that really hard. To me, that is a major part of the answer to deal with this gap. And we have the Kaliningrad problem, which Rich mentioned. We cannot afford to give the Russians or have the Russians believe that they have a sanctuary. I think the Kaliningrad problem is more a political problem within NATO than it is a military problem. We cannot let the Russians believe that they can have a sanctuary there to defeat our ability to reinforce. So I think there are other things that we need to be thinking about doing to close this gap.
Panel have thoughts on that?
Well, obviously we want to use the legacy systems, but I'm really concerned about air power's range problem. When the other side is shooting 3 times as far as you are, which means they can do unusual routes to get into your positions, and no one has invested significantly in air defense for air bases, then we have a huge problem. We have to assume they will know exactly where airplanes are. The commercial company Planet is imaging the entire planet every 24 hours and selling interpreted imagery every 24 hours. They plan to be at every 4 hours. I think it's in 4 years. Every 4 hours they'll image the whole planet. So in the workup, I know exactly where all your aircraft are sitting. I know how many they are. I have precision firing data for it. And so the question then is, if we're going to count on 30 squadrons in 30 days, there better be 30 battalions of air defense artillery as part of that package too, or the 30 squadrons aren't in the game on day 2. And I think this is one of the things we've got to realize, the enormous shift from legacy platforms. The carrier is a $25 billion target. Between the carrier and the air wing, it's $20 billion. And they're not enough range. The Navy's now admitting that and holding them back in the Pacific. So why am I spending $20 billion for a floating airfield that can't hurt anybody? We've got to start rethinking, and this gets back to the whole political process.
This sort of a digression, but possibly worth bearing in mind. We speak a lot about political will in terms of Allied action and defense spending, but there's also, I'm detecting in conversations in and out of the Beltway a public expectation that this is doable, right? Amazon can deliver anything overnight, right? Why wouldn't we be able to tackle this problem? I think there's a public expectation building that we shouldn't be letting our bureaucracies get in the way of this. This is easy. Amazon can do it. Walmart can do it. Why can't we? So
I think the problem is
yeah.
that Walmart doesn't deliver John Deere tractors.
Also true.
Amazon doesn't deliver it. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to deliver bulldozers, and so nobody goes to drones to deliver Caterpillars. But if you deliver stuff that can be delivered by drones and rethink it, then there's absolutely no reason we can't do it. And that's the mental shift.
Exactly. How do we use these technologies to, satisfy public expectations?
The really big question is, how do we use these technologies to create jobs in specific congressional districts? Because that's the primary function of the Pentagon for most representatives and senators. Move tax dollars to selected congressional districts. Sorry, I'm just mildly cynical here.
Important question. Steve Shapiro also had a few thoughts.
Just some color on the question of the political problem, which is obviously quite genuine. There may very well be a difference between Article 3 management and Article 5 management. Consensus under Article 5 is required. Article 3 has a continuous activity responsibility built into that, which seems to authorize SACEUR to be doing this daily on his or her own. So that may be one way around the political will problem that Harlan identifies, at least on a test case basis.
Yeah, the problem is not the will to buy the small stuff. The problem is freeing up the money from the expensive stuff from the 20th century we still want to buy.
But this is relatively cost effective, so couldn't you do, obviously the ultimate answer is a portfolio approach, and maybe it starts with smaller investments which seem to get a lot of bang for the buck.
Well, this is what I'm hoping happens with the Air Force and the Kratos drone. It's the helper partner replacement. This thing is really ready to be a partner today. And cruise missiles are already replacement in the long-range strike into denied environment. Why wouldn't the Kratos do that? Somebody's then going to ask, okay, we bought these drones, they go 1,500 miles, 3,000 we send them on a one-way trip, and we're going to control them from this airplane that can only get 500 miles out? How does that make sense? Those questions will start to arise as we start to do it. Then the question is, that's all very interesting, but what about jobs in my district problem?
Yes.
TX, John Watts from the Atlantic Council. Thanks for another thought-provoking talk. I want to talk a little bit about demonstrating the concepts. I mean, Russia is basically running a live lab in the Ukraine and Syria at the moment, testing some of these concepts out, testing out some of these technologies. There was an article out the other day about how they've been trying to use land-based, remotely operated vehicles and not having a huge amount of success with it. This approach, while theoretically is very compelling, it would be remiss of any military commander or politician to commit to it without having some confidence in its effectiveness, not just in the technology itself, but in the operational concepts and how that works with an adaptive enemy or adversary. So I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about live and virtual simulation and what's needed in terms of demonstrating the capability before it would be adopted and demonstrate that these approaches would actually be effective.
This is actually one of the few good news stories. The Navy has invested in unmanned ships if Congress lets it happen. They're looking at a missile merchant program. The Air Force is looking at the drones. The Marine Corps is looking at missile systems. The Army's trying to expand the existing systems. We're looking at hypervelocity. And each of these is being tied into exercises and war games. In fact, the Kratos drone, a predecessor to the Valkyrie, is the Mako drone. The Mako is actually flown at China Lake, with 3 of them flying forward from an AV-8, controlling them and using them for independent strike and independent air defense. So those are there and we're beginning to develop. Again, we're still in the assistant phase in some areas, we're in partner in others. We've got to explore how do you get from partner to replacement quickly, because that reduces your downstream cost. The thing that is really going to crush the defense budget is personnel cost. We've got to start shedding personnel. I know the Army wants more, but we shouldn't. And the Marine Corps should cut itself. Everybody should be looking at where do I trim personnel. And one of the ways is to go to these unmanned and autonomous. And there's the argument, as I said, we have this ridiculous argument on human in the loop or human on the loop. It's a very unethical argument. Both are failed systems. We admit they're failed systems. We have human on the loop rather than in the loop because humans can't keep up. Well, if you can't keep up in the loop, you sure as hell can't keep up on the loop monitoring multiple systems. So let's forget that and go to what we've done for at least 30 years in high-tech weaponry is human starts loop. What are the parameters, design parameters, training parameters, SOP parameters, operational parameters that say, when do I turn this weapon loose? So that you think about what happens after you turn it loose. Right now, we're about 8.5 months pregnant arguing whether we should have a baby or not. We've got these automated systems out there. We need to be arguing about how do I get this baby into college? How do I make it do what I want it to do as it grows up?
Very interesting. Other questions from the audience? I had one last question, and that is, you know, it's been mentioned here that information campaign and public diplomacy is an important part of any deterrent posture. We haven't really talked about that at all, and wanted to hear, especially from our Latvian colleague and from others, what might that look like if for a concept like this, and is there also a cyber component of this type of capability? Does cyber have a role as well as, what does the deterrent messaging look like? And I imagine it's a little bit of a steeper hill than normal, because you're not saying, see that armored brigade over there, we're deterring. You're saying, see this new stuff which people don't have as much familiarity and comfort with if you're trying to both assure and deter. Roland?
Well, I would start by saying that, you cannot deter by Stratcom itself. You deter by your actions and by your abilities which you demonstrate. That sends the best message. But at the same time, you actually have to, use Stratcom and also strengthen your own psychological resilience in these circumstances. And I think in Baltics we are currently winning this battle over the minds and hearts. We have very good instrument in the face of NATO Strategic Communication Center of Excellence, which do a great job in Riga of analyzing and revealing the tactics and techniques, and so it raises awareness. And we are nationally doing many steps actually to strengthen our own resilience against well, disinformation and fake news. So we are introducing even in schools now subjects about critical thinking, about statehood. We are investing in investigative journalism, and we are organizing seminars, conferences for teachers, for entrepreneurs, explaining them what's going on in the world, what's their role, and I think our society at the moment is quite resilient against all those narratives, but that's a constant job, of course.
I'm not sure we have a strong message to send right now. So let's start with nuclear deterrence. I don't think that Putin decided that he was going to try to fracture NATO by taking a little bit of Baltic territory. I don't think he fears that a nuclear response. I think that's very unlikely. Most people don't think we would use nuclear weapons in that scenario, so okay, that's kind of out of the narrative. Are the forces that are in place in the region right now enough to impose a kind of cost on Putin that might cause him to pause? Well, at least right now, I think the argument is no, not really. He'd be where he wants to be in a few days. What about the heavy potential that NATO has to reinforce and to take that territory back? Well, that's not a great story either. For years to come, it'll take months for Germany, the UK, and France, the biggest powers, to put so much as a single division into that part of Europe. And more or less the same with their air forces and with their naval forces. So that's not a strong message either. So we have a lot of work to do on all these fronts if we want to have an adequate deterrent posture in place, which is so essential if we want to make sure that this never happens. If Harlan is right, and there's no circumstance where Putin would ever ponder aggression in the eastern flank, then we're going to have a lot fewer meetings at the Atlantic Council and other places around town. But I'm not so sure. No.
Again, like I said in my talk, the key is to demonstrate it. Launch 1,000 drones out of a canister. Then paint a whole bunch of canisters that look like it and move them all over the country. So do I have one drone canister or do I have 50 drone canisters? Detonate a 50,000 pound IED once a year. That will get your attention. It will register on your seismic systems.
Like it.
And things like that that say, we're going to play a different game. You know where our tanks are. You know where our airplanes are. You figure you can deal with them. I'm going to give you, just raise the uncertainty. And you can raise the uncertainty at a fairly low cost, particularly if you kind of pretend to be bigger than you are, which is part of what a porcupine or a hedgehog does. They puff out too. They get all fluffed out with when a hedgehog rolls in a ball, it's bigger than it looks. So, and again, this gets into your point about the whole NATO narrative on 2% and getting the NATO nations aboard. They can all do things like this. I mean, maybe rather than flying jets, you launch a couple of cruise missiles from somewhere deep in Germany in the forest, and they detonate somewhere in a range 2 countries away. And of course, advertise it. You have the news media up, you watch the launch, you use Google Maps or something to watch it track across, and then you show it detonate. And say, we can do this today.
And I think another dimension of that, going back to one of the first points I made, is it's about NATO decision making in these crisis situations. And there's, if adversaries do not believe that NATO could even take a political decision in sufficient time, then we've got a significant problem. Well, if that's the case, then again, the model that we've utilized for coalition operations, where we have minilateral groups that take the initiative and then reinforced by NATO in the fullness of time. In ISAF, it took a couple of years, right? Maybe that's the way forward. And why I point to that as both a possible solution, but also a friction point is, again, going back to the Afghanistan experience, there was real concerns that if we operated in regional commands, if we operated as smaller groups, that it would undermine overall NATO allied coherence and credibility. So how do we manage that tension when there's likely to be small actors operating initially and with a follow-up force later, with a NATO that's got a variety of different security challenges that it must address, in a way that ultimately underscores NATO allied solidarity, not undermines it? It's a huge political strategic challenge, and I'm looking forward to people fleshing out those solutions.
Great, well, thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I really enjoyed and learned from this conversation. I really hope we can push this through to get this adopted, and we'll be working with those on the panel and many others in the Atlantic Council network to get something like this done. If you have other ideas, other comments, please keep conversation going with us. You know how to reach us, and please join me in thanking our panelists.